And we are live. Hey guys, this is Ruben Dua from Dubb's podcast. Today I have Ryan Sullivan. We're going to get into the topic of creating a business podcast. Now, creating a podcast is very intimidating. We when we think of a podcast, we think of sometimes a professionally produced piece, a Joe Rogan type, where everything is rock solid. You've got these, celebrity guests. And that's not the case. Some of the best podcasts out there, in my opinion, are podcasts that are genuine and authentic, and they're practical. We can learn something and actually apply it to our business. So Ryan and I are going to get into the topic of podcasting. And Ryan has some extensive experience with that. Ryan, love to get a short bio from you, and let's get into the topic.
For sure. And thanks, Ruben. I really appreciate you having me here, and I'm really excited to do this and just give people as much value as possible when it comes to podcasting. But my name's Ryan Sullivan. I've been podcasting myself for a little over 3 years. Started it as something that was it was fun for me, to be honest. And people asked me to do it. They're like, hey, I think this idea, I know you love podcasts. You should just start one yourself. And I'm like, why not? Right. Barrier to entry is not there. It's not like some of these other industries. You can really just be a self-starter. So started my show about 3 years ago. Been doing that. We're on I think we've had episode 55 or something. And that was a monthly show. Now it's a weekly show. And 2 years ago, I got hired at a marketing company to create a podcast for them. And that had been the first podcast I created for somebody else. And from that, I learned, the world of business. I learned business, startups, business development, sales, marketing. I learned all these business things. But the original reason I was there was to create a podcast for them. So I learned, how do you book guests on a business podcast? How do you use the guests to leverage their network? How do you, break down the posts into other forms of content? All these different things. I was kind of like, okay, yes, I can do it. I'll figure it out. I'll figure out how to do it and give me the leeway. So that was a great starting point for me to learn, how to do a podcast besides my own. And from there, I left the company. And towards the end, it just wasn't a great fit for me, and just realized my value was a lot more. I could just help a lot more people rather than doing it for one company. And now I've founded this company called Podcast Principles, and we've been in business for almost exactly a year now. So been really fulfilling. Left a lot of things out in that journey, but that's really the gist.
Nice. So what would you say the hardest part of creating a podcast is?
Hardest part. Consistency.
Yeah.
And keeping it going. That's the hardest part. I can speak for myself. What, the hardest part is for me. That has just been the hardest part for me. So for other people, it might be getting on the mic. Like me and you, we have no problem. We've done music, we've done things. We have no problem getting in front of people and talking on video and on the microphone. So sometimes
I'm a drummer primarily, so I'm in the back of the stage.
Oh, okay. So
I started farthest away from the mic.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you have some people in life who are more the drummer, who are keeping the beat, and they're a little bit better at putting things in order, right? And then some people are the front man. And they don't keep the beat. They're just going off of, the structure that's happening behind them, right? So all these different personalities. But yeah, I'd say the main thing that I've seen, and for myself and others, is probably just keeping it going.
Yeah. I would say, one of the things that I've definitely suffered from this, and I've heard people share that they suffer from this, is the idea of imposter syndrome, where when they start to interview someone, they feel like this announcer personality, and that's not who they are, because they're just this person and that's what they do. And a lot of people struggle with that. And when in fact, a podcast it's just a recorded conversation. Just because we hear podcasters talking in the announcer voice and interviewing questions in a certain way doesn't mean that we need to emulate that. In my opinion, just be yourself.
That's it. 100. I've never met you before. This is the first time we've even spoken, and we're having doing this podcast right now. That's just a testament to, obviously we set all this up beforehand. But that's just a testament to, just be yourself. The thing about a podcast, you can't hide. You can't even be somebody else, because people will immediately know. You have to be yourself, because it's so, you have to be you. People are asking you the questions, right? So they're not asking your persona or your online persona, or your digital persona. That's the great thing about podcasts too, is if you have things online, where you have a certain purpose, you can actually, a podcast is a great place for people to actually get to know you and who you are, and kind of gives you that leeway.
Yeah, for real. So true. So let's talk about the logistics a little bit. How do you kind of book your guests? How do you get them to show up, to not flake? How do you come up with the title, come up with the content? How do you publish it? Then how do you market it? We'll start from the beginning. You don't have to answer a full answer on all that, but I'd love to understand the individual steps.
For me, it starts with the why. And I just take kind of a business approach to it, right? So I treat every podcast like a business. It doesn't matter if you have revenue or not. It doesn't matter if you're making money or not. It doesn't matter if you have listeners or not. Still treating it like a business. And we're starting from the why, and we're reverse engineering from the goal and the why, right? So your why is, why am I making this podcast? Like, is it for impact? Is it for awareness? Is it to just help people, just educate, right? Whatever that why is, that ultimate thing. And then what's the goal? Do I want to make an impact, but also make some sales? Okay, let's just be super honest about that up front. So then we can reverse engineer it from that goal. So I always start with, like, I don't go into the title and all these kind of logistical things. I really just start with that main question of why. What's the why? What's the goal? Then after that, who's the ideal listener? Who's the ideal guest, if it is a guest-based show? And then you as the host, what are you getting out of it, right? So those are my 5 questions I always start with. And in my opinion, it just builds that foundation for where, when you are making a decision, you can always go back to, does it fulfill the why, or does it fulfill the goal? It makes the decision-making process a little bit easier too. So I always start with those foundational questions before we even get into anything podcast related.
And I think that by establishing the why and creating the foundation, the chances of fatiguing, of being inconsistent, go down dramatically, because there's a larger purpose.
You're not freestyling. You have no room to freestyle now. Yeah. Like, and testing 100%. I'm not saying we're not testing. We're testing all the time. We're just not freestyling it all, and just seeing what sticks. We actually are going to start from that goal and that why, and then that's going to be able to, kind of put us in a lane so we can drive in it,
Yeah. And then a question that came up while you were saying that is, how do you solve the long form problem? And what I mean by that is that podcasts are long form. The listener needs to commit 20, 30, maybe 60 minutes, maybe hours, depending on the length of the podcast. How do you get someone to take time out of their day and to choose your podcast in this long form format over all the Netflix shows and the more professionally produced podcasts and the music and books on tape, so on and so forth? How do you punch through? How do you actually get that listener?
Yeah, I kind of relate it to music, where there's 40, whatever. I think it used to be 40,000 songs a day, but it's probably upwards of 100,000 songs a day being uploaded to Spotify every day. But those artists are not looking at the 99,999 other songs and saying, oh, I'm just not going to upload mine, right? So as far as, there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of media, right? So great question that you asked. It's hard to ask somebody to say, hey, I know you only have a certain amount of time in your week, but will you set aside an hour to listen to my podcast that I only have 3 episodes of? It's a super hard ask. So my answer to that would be, there's different fans of your podcast. Some fans love your audio version 1 hour because they have a 1 hour commute every day, probably. So on Mondays, they're ready. They listen to your podcast every Monday because it goes out at Monday at 6 a.m. Their commute is from 7 to 8, and like, they're ready. It's in their routine. I could talk about the process of, getting them to actually listen on a weekly basis. But so that's one version of the listener. The other person is kind of like me, which I'm a weirdo. I watch video podcasts. Like, if I was going to watch this podcast, I'd watch the video version. And I still listen to audio podcasts, but I love watching the video. I don't know why. It's me. There's other people who they only watch 1 to 5 minute clips on YouTube of your podcast, but they're still a fan. Like, each one of those people is a fan of your podcast. But the guy who listens to the audio, they can talk to the girl who watches the 3-minute clips, and they're like, oh, you listen to that? Well, yeah. And they'll ask about the rest of the conversation and be like, oh, I just watched that clip. Like, they still took value from it. They didn't need the whole 1 hour thing. So, but some people might like that. So there's different types of fans. And you kind of have to take that into account and then do the work to make sure your content is ready for those different types of fans.
Yeah, I love that. I'm constantly trying to think on how I can start with niche and then, build and expand from that. So, my niche, my new niche in video podcast is the standing video podcast because I'm standing right now. So it's very niche. It's very specific.
Man, it's just the stand. Hey, you got the standing pod now.
Yeah, I'm on the I'm on the standing pod track.
Standards, man. It's the standards, high standards, man. That's what we're reading.
That's right. One of the things that we love to do with our podcast is, micro clips, taking the 30, 60-minute video and then chopping it down into 30 seconds, 30, 60-second clips. And then those are great for social media. We do them in square format, sort of headline, kind of meme text with some live captions, even with sound off. People can enjoy those. And those sort of fuel our social channels. You mentioned clips. What is it that you guys do to create short clips from your full podcasts?
Yeah, so it's really, I'm always going to work with the host and the podcaster on this. Like, say if I'm talking about like working with a client and working with their podcast, where it's really going to be, first of all, the testing, right? Because I bet you're testing every clip you post is a test. Because you're like, okay, this one's sound off with just subtitles. This one is about this topic within my niche or this topic within my niche. This one's 45 seconds. This one's 15 seconds. So there's really no formula for the clips as far as what I've seen. But I really like to do that testing. And, we always do at least one per episode, but hey, you have a whole entire podcast, 60 minutes. Now, the clips can get a little expensive, so I actually also teach people how to do them on their phone for free. That's how I started. I started making clips right here on this iPhone with 3 separate apps. I just figured it out. It took hours and hours and hours. But so there's a bunch of different ways to do it. But I'd say the testing, you're going to know once you post 20, 30 clips, which clips do the best and which do the best for your audience. And then, okay, I can kind of iterate on that. I can ask a couple more questions in the next podcast that will relate to that topic. So then I'll have more clips that work.
Well, I really appreciate that you have made it your purpose to support people with creating a podcast, with producing it, with publishing it, with marketing it, with creating, sounds like, social clips from it. Because I'll say this, that creating the system in-house it took us a year. It took us a year solidly. I mean, we went through so many experiments. We tried so much different software. Where we landed was kind of a unique place with live streaming and then using Dubb to, share micro clips and then having those micro clips become part of our social channels. But that process took us a tremendous amount of time. So I highly encourage anyone to that is interested in producing a podcast or at least strategizing about how to start a podcast to reach out to you, because I know how much work that goes into it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. And also what you're doing is great. I have to, give a shout out to somebody that I've been able to work with, a show that I've been able to work with. It's called the Who You Know Job Networking Show. And I have edited probably 180 episodes of their show. And almost every single episode, they talk about video content in the DMs, video content in the email, video. It's the best way to break through. And so when I saw Dubb, I'm thinking, yep, they get it. It's what can we use as what's going to create that human connection. And text just doesn't, at least for me, text really doesn't do it. I want to hear your voice. I want to see you. Right. And so what you're doing, and it works with podcasts. Perfect. Right. Like taking the long form, breaking it down, it works for that too. So I really appreciate you saying that about me, but what you guys are doing is, equally or more impressive in video. I'm so bullish on video for right now and the future.
Yeah, well, I think it's the easiest method to create content, to get it out there. Anything that you want to do, you can start with video, whether it's for prospecting or whether it's for podcasting or whether it's for communicating with an existing client, sharing your screen. So obviously, we're very bullish about it. Just drinking the Kool-Aid, if you will.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Yeah. So how much of your process do you spend on marketing a podcast? What are some tips that you might recommend to us to better market a podcast? When people start to think about spending money to get podcast listeners, it starts to get very intimidating, because is there a clear call to action? Is that attributable to a sale? It gets very murky. Give us some marketing tips.
Yeah, so my expertise, I would not say is I totally understand the marketing side of it, but I'm not an ads person. I'm not going to be able to like run your social media and things like that. I'm mostly production. So I typically recommend if we're not working with somebody that's marketing savvy to at least have somebody who understands branding to come on and pay them for an hour just to do a strategy call and really align. But as far as marketing, I'm on the side of guerrilla marketing. I guess you would call it, like going in the Facebook groups and just giving value. And I'm in like, I think like 10, 12 different Facebook groups. I'm just posting tips and how-to stuff in there. And then a few people will, trickle down and then maybe want to work with me or just want some more value, right? So when it comes to a podcast, if you're going in these podcast Facebook groups, you're not going to say, hey, this is my podcast, listen to it. You're going to say, hey, we talked about these 3 things. This is what you're going to get out of this episode, by the way. And these groups exist. So you can literally just post. And the better you frame your advertisement, which is whatever that post is, the more people are going to want to listen to your podcast. So my, tip would be, to do that. And like, those are ways to kind of accelerate it, but also get in the DMs, talk to people, say, this is my podcast. It's going to help you. If you have a podcast for college students, I'd be DMing 100 Gary V method, DMing hundreds or thousands of college students. It's free. So for me, I always am giving, since I'm not a marketing expert as far as running campaigns and things like that, I'm always giving the free guerrilla marketing tactics. And those are literally getting those direct messages and max out your connections on LinkedIn, max out your DMs on Instagram, just because it's valuable. If it's so valuable, then you should have no problem asking people to listen and telling them this is the value you're going to get from this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
If not, then they're going to go listen to another one because there's millions of them now. So yeah, those are my tactics. I'm full kind of like doing that real grind.
Well, you're all about the community. There are groups that exist. There are tribes where people are collaborating. We've got Discord, we've got Facebook groups, we've got LinkedIn, we've got Clubhouse. There's all these new methods where people are connecting, and that's the future. Twitter Spaces. All the Clubhouse competitors that are kind of popping off. LinkedIn now is going to be announcing one soon. That is where people are consuming content. That's where people are sharing ideas. Yeah. Clubhouse. So it just, you have to be present though. You got to be out there. And I think to your earlier point, you have to be providing value, like 100% value. If someone wants to, click on your bio to learn about what you do and then make a decision of working with you, they have that choice. But I would say 100% value oriented, not even 99.9, because even sometimes adding a call to action, like, hey, if you want to work with me, reach out, even that will annoy some people. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you have to. Yeah, you almost just want to be unapologetically valuable. Like, if you can do that, and
I don't need more business. I'm just here to provide value.
Yeah,
and if you want to work with me, that's cool.
Well, it's also just like what I say to people, like, hey, we don't need to book a call unless you're looking for a production company to run your podcast. Like, it's okay. Like, hey, you can if you want. Like, we can talk for half an hour. I could give you a bunch of tips. I'm always down to do that too. But kind of in the, you're not going to talk to somebody if you don't think you're going to get value out of it anyway. So yeah, 100%, man, to your point.
Yeah, so true. Now, when we talk about production, sometimes this idea of editing a podcast is in fact intimidating. Okay, because one of my favorite podcasts is called Brains On, which I listen to with my 7-year-old son, and it's a science kind of educational, very kind of STEAM oriented podcast. It's for kids, but also adults enjoy it, and they have all these different segments. You're never bored in this podcast. They have. I'm just trying to remember all these cool segments. They're all like, my mind is being flooded with them right now. But there's always a state change, so there's a narrator, they have guests, they have the kids that come on, they have cool sounds. How much production do you think we need to put into our podcast? We don't put a lot of production into them. We barely even cut stuff out because it's just gooey and conversational. But I know that that's not always the best method. What is your take on that?
My opinion on like the conversational podcast, like I love them. I love to peep Joe Rogan style podcast. That's how I came up. That's how I learned about podcasts. That's totally my thing. So, but when it comes to creating podcasts for other people, you really do have to look at what does this production look like? Let's go back to the goal. If our goal is, or if we know there's going to be kids and parents listening, there's no way we can do an hour-long podcast of just a stream of consciousness. There's no way. It's not going to work. So they knew that podcast you're speaking of, Brains On, they knew that they had to keep attention the whole time. But that was probably only because it related to their goal of the podcast, which was we want to make it exciting for kids and parents to listen. And we don't want people to, have to or want to turn it off. Right. But as far as production goes, I think it's good to understand what your producer's doing, like understand production. I don't know. I would not advise trying to learn it yourself. If you don't have any experience in it, it's just very overwhelming. But I've done podcasts where it's narrative based, and we have sound effects, and there's a lot of musical interludes that come in and come out, and it creates like a flow. And then I've done other ones that are strictly conversational, and that the conversation just goes stream of consciousness. We barely edit anything else. So I know it's like the answer that everybody always says, but it really does depend on what the goal is, because some podcasts like that Brains On podcast, like I said, they need to edit that way, and that's also their best content is coming from there. So if your best content is coming from the way that you're editing, then you have to edit that way. So yeah, my opinion, I love conversational style, but I would not put that on other people. We're gonna just look at it completely as unbiased as possible and determine what that production needs to look like for the listeners.
Yeah, I mean, there's this adage that sometimes doing too much production actually takes away from the authenticity of it. So one of the things that I've always wanted to try is actually being a narrator / guest / segment style podcast. It's sort of changing the style of Connection Loop. I've thought about it, but the reason why I've never done it is because it takes away from that authentic moment of discovering, reacting, learning on the fly, and having people really feel like they're genuinely part of a conversation. And that's kind of what I connect to. So I think we share that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the conversational aspect. It's my favorite part.
Yeah. So where can we learn more about you, your, social channels, your production company?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn all the time. So I'm always posting how-to content on there, as well as my Facebook page. So the LinkedIn is Ryan R. Sullivan. If you look up Ryan Sullivan, you might not find me. So we have the R in there. There's a million people with my name. It's just how it is. So sullybop.com is also, that's my website, and that's my music and my hip hop and rap. And I do other things other than the podcast, and that's kind of the entirety of that website is, everything that I do. And that's sullybop.com. And then finally, just Podcast Principles is the business. That's the production company. And you could find us anywhere on social media. So on any of those channels is fine. Facebook, Instagram. I know it's on the screen right now. Podcast Principles. You can Google that or search that on social. And yeah, for me, like, just connect with me. Shoot me a message. Just, I'm just trying to connect with as many people as possible. So no need to be passive if you don't want to. I'm always down to have a conversation. So
nice. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sully. Appreciate you, and look forward to listening to your next podcast.
Same. And I look forward to listening to the next one of these too. I really appreciate you doing this. This is a great platform, and video podcast. That's what I'm talking about, man. So thank you, Ruben. Really appreciate you having me on here. Thank you.
Yeah. Stick around for some notes, and thanks again.